mouth, what sensation would you have? What type of orange juice do you buy in the store? What does its container look like? Just take a moment to visualize. Now, think about if an orange has always looked this way, the way that you've imagined in your mind, the way that you imagined the bottle looking in the store. Think about what your parents' oranges look like, or your parents' orange juice look like. What kind of containers did those come in? What kind of oranges did they see? What access did they have to oranges? If you think about your parents, and maybe even generations before that, how did they first come to know what an orange was? And that's where I want to start today, because I'm talking about the history of oranges. The orange is actually the most cultivated fruit tree in the world. Many people think it's the apple, but that's not true, even though apples are one of the most popular fruits. I've already spent enough time talking about apples in my life. So we're going to move forward. It's traveled from China to Italy. The Dutch brought it to South Africa, and even Christopher Columbus is supposedly the person who brought it to America, among many other things. Now, why did oranges come to dominate? Well, oranges, perhaps it's because they feel more human in some ways. The navel orange, for example, as I have here on display, it represents a belly button. I already cut one up. Let's find a good. Oh yeah, see, like this. I can't really show mine off right now. I've got this whole shirt on, but you can imagine if you think about your own belly button, what a belly button looks like, right? So this belly button, this mark of birth, is where we can start to see the inner fruit of the orange. The skin here peels away and we see consequences. So if we peel away a little bit of skin there, we can see, well, one consequence is it gets real juicy. We can also see this kind of inner layer too between the skin and the fruit. Now, we see these layers of skin, and we see that there's this extra kind of inner dermis layer that prevents us from getting to the fruit itself, that kind of bitter rind. So the outside of the orange, known as the skin, will be important later. When we think about that idea of orange skin, maybe it makes us think about the humanity of our own skin. Did you know that there is a classification for having orange skin, a medical diagnosis? Actually, it's called carcinemia. It doesn't, I don't think, apply to Donald Trump, but it could. That's not what I came to talk about. I actually didn't even write that down because I didn't really want to bring it up. But I'm just trying to think of examples so that you have an image of like an orange skinned person. Now, this kind of medical diagnosis of skin turning orange from overconsumption of keratin-producing or pigmented foods, such as carrots, oranges, things like that, are literally turning people's skin orange if you eat too much of it. But probably not any of us are eating too many oranges. Let's see. Oh, great, there's like a little garbage bag here. Now, I don't think that's the case with Cheetos, actually. I think the orange that happens there is called Cheeto pneumonia, if you eat too many of those. So what I do want to focus on, actually, is looking at, now that we've thought about oranges as semi-human, how they relate to us, I want to look at an example of oranges as a prized commodity. Let me know if I'm not speaking loud enough because I'm like looking into oranges. Great. So let's look at this from a literary history. So in the Italian fairy tale, The Three Citrons, a young prince is pressured by his father to marry, as many young princes are, you know. He cuts his finger over a block block of white cheese. Hopefully that doesn't happen to me right now. And he sees a vision of a woman with white skin and blood red lips. So the prince travels abroad in search of this wife who's going to resemble this vision he has. He goes on a path in a foreign land. He's directed along the way by 3 older women. Once he gets to the 3rd woman, she provides him with 3 oranges. Now, her warning to him, of course, because you're always going to have an old woman warning you of something in a fairy tale. She warns him not to open the oranges until he gets back to his kingdom and has gotten to a fountain there. Now he returns home and he stops at the very first fountain that he sees. And there he opens up the first orange, and in his amazement at seeing this fairy fly out of it, he forgets to give her water, and she quickly dies. So he does the same thing with the second orange, opens it up, still too amazed by this, lets her die. He's not a fast learner. So of course we have a 3rd orange, fortunately. And on the 3rd try, he realizes what to do. He gets her the water right away, this fairy presence, and once she had enough water, she transforms into a full-grown woman with white skin, rosy cheeks, and blood red lips. Now, this is just like the vision he was shown, so he's like, okay, I'm totally going to marry this lady now. Prior to their wedding, the fairy princess-to-be resides in a tree above the fountain so she can look at herself in it, because I guess they didn't really have access to mirrors then. So in this same time, they live in this vast kingdom. A slave is sent to fetch water from that fountain. And when she goes to the fountain, she sees the reflection of the fairy in it and thinks, oh, that's my reflection. I'm seeing myself for the first time. And so she breaks the pot that she was going to use to fetch water in protest of the labor that she's doing, because she is saying that her appearance is such that she shouldn't be doing this type of labor. She returns to the well twice more, sent out by her mistress to fetch more water, and in that time period, she breaks the other vessels that she was going to use to carry, because rule of 3s, it's a fairy tale, we gotta follow that logic, right? And so, on the 3rd trip is when she realizes, she sees her actual own reflection and realizes that she's not that fairy up in the tree. And so she tells the fairy to come down and comb out your hair. But while she's doing this and helping the fairy comb out her hair, she sticks a hairpin into her head. Though not getting water fast enough kills fairies, somehow getting jabbed in the head, severe head trauma, does not kill them. I don't know how that works, but fairy tale logic. And to escape, she turns into a dove and flies away. Now, the prince returns to the fountain. It's nearing the wedding day, and instead of the woman he thought he was going to marry, he sees a black woman there. And he says, well, what happened here, the slave pretends that she had been transformed by a curse. I don't know what the whole story is there, because it doesn't really get into it. It just says, hey, I got cursed. And so, because of this curse, she's no longer fair, she's black. The slave pretends to be the fairy, and the prince still commits to marrying her. This is still the same person he thought he was going to marry in the first place. And so the day of the wedding arrives, and that's when the dove decides to return, the fairy princess dove, whatever creation, comes back, someone pulls the pin out of her head, and she reveals the whole truth. And because of that, the final thing is that they sentence the slave to death for lying. And that's how the fairy tale ends. Great. That's not the end of the lecture. Now, let's talk about looking. I might have to just cut off of the cutting board. So in this story, I don't want to just talk about looking, but I want to talk about the consumption that comes along with looking. I guess I should clarify. So in the story, the prince doesn't want a bride until he bleeds into a block of cheese. And then at that point, he only desires a white girl with rosy cheeks and blood red lips. He lives in Italy, so he has to travel a ways to kind of go find that. And he goes on a long journey to find this girl that's hidden in a colonized fruit, as we can see. And this particular fetishization coincides with this idea of racialized beauty standards, that this perfect woman residing in this colonized fruit that's been sent over tells us that the image of a woman, of a beautiful woman, will be moving in this direction towards this kind of pure whiteness. Now, the fairy, so while this white fairy is a kind of idealized beauty, the black woman in the story is represented as a slave, and she's only worthy of attention in the absence of whiteness. So the story deeply racializes desirability as a hierarchy of white bodies over black, and this story is 400 years old, let me mention that, but I don't think it deviates too much from today. I think we're still haunted by some of the legacies of racialized beauty standards that go into this story. Now, instead of this prejudice being transformed, we kind of continue to reinforce it today, and we're going to talk about that more. It's transferred, much like the orange trees, through such tales across Europe and into America. Let's sing that one. Hold on to this. Oh, let me just cut these parts up. So we're just taking a quick break as I go into part 2. That was part 1, Orange You Glad. And part 2 is called Orange You Gladder. Now, and as we move into this section, we have another poetic text to read. So, navel oranges approximate fetal development. It's really sticky. They pout their puckered mouths as though umbilical cut too soon. Fetal in display, alcohol, not brain. A parasite left too long, the body. If you want to just take a slice, I prefer that you don't eat it, and can you pass around the tray too, so I can continue to read. But if you are really hungry for orange, you're welcome to eat them. Now, the body takes in toxins and releases. It lives for toxicity, and to connective tissue does damage. Pen to snip, what does not bear fruit, in service of the whole. Atrophy release, appendage waste houses. So now we have more demonstrating to do, so I'm just going to remove this so we can help out. Let's see. We've got everything ready to go here. Great. All right. So how do we think about this idea of the orange carrying across this idea of racialized beauty standards? Or just what do we call preferences today that might have deeper connotations? When you think about oranges, and when you think about the taste of an orange, what else can it spark in you? If you're thinking about flavors, how does chocolate taste to you? What about the color of chocolate, or mocha, or caramel? How do you think about these terms when they're applied to skin color? I think literature is full of examples that we see these food modifiers being applied to people's bodies as the kind of singular way that they're identified. And this is not only in literature, this is in social life. We can see this type of classification being played out. Just go check your Tinder, probably. You will find some variation on this being applied to someone's skin color. If it's a way to keep a person dehumanized or consumable in a way that white people don't recognize in themselves. And this is in order to maintain, and this is as termed, I have a quote from Claudia Rankine and Beth Lofreda's On Whiteness and the Racial Imaginary to help think about this idea is that the universal is a fantasy, and that is that we are captive still to a sensibility that champions the universal while simultaneously defining the universal still as white. That universality of whiteness is what causes nude-colored items, in particular to white bodies, and pretends white bodies, or precludes them from being food-coded in the same way. So I propose, to kind of combat this, that we start a swatch of food labeling skin tones for white people. So the Museum of Unnatural History, who I'm here to represent today, introduces the food Pantone for white folks, and I'm going to use myself as a model. So here we have, I went with ricotta because it was more Italian, so it was my version of cream cheese for this. We have cream of potato soup, and we have vanilla pudding. Let's just flush this open. So this Pantone scale, let's just get a little dab of each, shall we? Ooh. All right, we'll start with the ricotta. And next we'll follow up the cream of potato. And finally the vanilla pudding. That one's a little slippery. Okay. So if we look at this Pantone, oh great, we've got good gallery lighting here for this. So I think applying this Pantone scale, my skin color is closest to the ricotta cheese. We can also call it cream cheese. So if you happen to be writing about me or talking about me out in public, you can feel free to refer to me as cream cheese color. That would be totally acceptable. The scale of whiteness should help us evolve our language to more actively describe white people as particular in some way, and not a universality, or not a universal white that's unexamined. So if you have trouble because you weren't sure in the past what shade of white, and so you want to call a person white to describe your white compatriots by, please ask me and I can help you develop a food Pantone scale of your own. And I think to avoid a mess and not go any longer, we'll keep the orange peels to yourself instead of having me be dripped in them. So feel free to enjoy your navel oranges. Thank you.